Technician Wilma Guillen of the Social Sector Statistics Service, Ms. Divina Gracia Del Prado of the Economic Statistics Service, Ms. Elena Varona of the Price Statistics Division. Before we begin, we'd like to remind everyone that this press briefing will be streamed live on our Facebook page, Philippine Statistics Authority, and will also be tweeted at PSA.gov.ph. To begin the briefing on the inflation report, let us all please welcome Assistant Secretary Claire Dennis S.
Good morning, everyone. The Philippine Statistics Authority is pleased to report the inflation rate of the Philippines for the month of February 2020. The country's headline inflation is slowed down to 2.6% in February 2020. This brings the year-to-date inflation to 2020 to 2.8%. Inflation rate in January 2020 was recorded at 2.9%, and in February 2019, 3.8%. The main source of the downward trend in February 2020 inflation was the slower annual increment in transport. Specifically, the annual increase in petroleum and fuels for personal transport equipment decelerated to 1.2% in February 2020 from 13.0% in January 2020. The slower annual rate in alcoholic beverages and tobacco also pushed down the overall inflation in February 2020. Particularly, the annual rate in cigarettes eased to 23.4% in February 2020 from 25.3% in January 2020. Furthermore, the slower annual rate observed in housing, water, electricity, gas, and other fuels also contributed to the downtrend in February 2020 inflation. This was primarily due to the annual declines observed in kerosene at negative 3.8% in February 2020 from 6.1% in January 2020, and electricity negative 6.4% from negative 2.3%. Moreover, the annual rate of LPG slowed down to 10.8% in February 2020 from 13.8% in January 2020. Among the 11 major commodity groups, the top contributor to the February 2020 inflation was food and non-alcoholic beverages, with an annual rate of 2.1% and a share of 33.2% to the overall inflation. Contributing to the inflation of food and non-alcoholic beverages for February 2020 were the following food groups: fish, 8.6% inflation and 77.6% share; vegetables, 7.8% inflation and 31.9% share; and meat, 2.9% inflation and 28.5% share. The second major contributor to the overall inflation was housing, water, electricity, gas, and other fuels, which recorded an inflation of 1.7% and a share of 15.5% to the overall inflation. The commodities that mainly contributed to the February 2020 inflation of housing, water, electricity, gas, and other fuels were the following: actual rent hours for housing, 3.2% inflation and 121.5% share; LPG, 10.8% inflation and 40.9% share; and fuel wood, 7.5% inflation and 17.7% share. The third commodity group that largely contributed to the overall inflation was restaurant and miscellaneous goods and services, which had a 2.6% inflation and 13.5% share to the overall inflation in February 2020. Specific commodities that contributed to the February 2020 inflation of restaurant and miscellaneous goods and services were the following: meats eaten outside the home, 2.7% inflation and 63.7% share. Personal care, 2.8% inflation and 31.2% share. And personal effects, 2.0% inflation and 3.4% share. Among the commodity groups, the following registered slower annual growth rates in February 2020. Food and non-alcoholic beverages, 2.1%. Alcoholic beverages and tobacco, 18.2%. Housing, water, electricity, gas, and other fuels, 1.7%. And transport, 1.8%. On the other hand, a higher annual increment of 3.55% was noted in the index of furnishing, household equipment, and routine maintenance of the house. Meanwhile, the following commodity groups retained their January 2020 annual rates. Clothing and footwear, 2.7%. Health, 2.9%. Communication, 0.4%. Recreation and culture, 1.5%. Education, 4.7%. And restaurant and miscellaneous goods and services, 2.6%. Inflation in the National Capital Region decelerated further to 2.0% in February 2020. Its annual rate in January 2020 was higher than at 2.7%, and in February 2019, 3.8%. In the National Capital Region, the annual rate of housing, water, electricity, gas, and other fuels index dropped by 0.7%. Moreover, annual increases were slower in the indices of food and non-alcoholic beverages at 3.1%, alcoholic beverages and tobacco 13.4%, and transport 0.6%. Among the food groups in the National Capital Region, annual decreases were noted in corn, rice, and sugar. Inflation in areas outside the National Capital Region eased to 2.8% in February 2020. It was recorded at 3.0% in January 2020 and 3.8% in February 2019. Among the regions in areas outside the National Capital Region, Region 5 or Bicol Region still recorded the highest inflation at 3.6% in February 2020. In January 2020, it was higher at 3.9%. The downtrend in the February 2020 inflation in Bicol Region was mainly contributed by the slower annual growth rates observed in the following commodity groups. Food and non-alcoholic beverages, 1.3%. Alcoholic beverages and tobacco, 33.6%. Clothing and footwear, 4.1%. Transport, 2.7%. Communication, 0.7%. And restaurant and miscellaneous goods and services, 3.2%. Among the food groups in Bicol Region, rice, sugar, and corn posted slower annual increments in February 2020. In February 2020, Region 8 or Eastern Visayas had the slowest inflation of 1.9% among the regions in areas outside the National Capital Region. Its annual rate in January 2020 was noted at 2.2%. Relative to the inflation in January 2020, 6 regions in areas outside the National Capital Region exhibited lower inflation in February 2020. On the other hand, 8 regions had higher inflation in February 2020. Mimaropa Region and Caraga retained their January 2020 annual growth rates. Based on the preliminary results, the country's inflation for the bottom 30% income households slowed down to 2.2% in February 2020. Inflation for the bottom 30% income in households in January 2020 was posted at 2.3%, and in February 2019, 4.3%. The final and detailed results for the bottom 30% income households inflation will be available at the PSA website within the month. This ends my presentation on inflation in the Philippines for February 2020. Thank you.
Thank you, Asik de la Cruz. We would like to request everyone to please hold their questions And let us all welcome Assistant National Statistician Wilma A. Gillian to present the January 2020 Labor Force Survey preliminary results.
The Philippine Statistics Authority is also pleased to report the preliminary result of the January 2020 Labor Force Survey. Population 15 years old and over was estimated at 73 million in January 2020. This estimate was placed at 71.89 million last year of the same period. Out of this population, 45.04 million were part of the labor force in January 2020 compared to 43.31 last year of the same month. The labor force participation rate increased in January 2020 to 61.7% from 60.3% in January 2019. Year-on-year employment rate remained stable at 94.7% this January 2020. This translates to 42.65 million employed persons in January 2020, which is higher than the 41.03 million in January 2019 due to higher labor force this year. Unemployment rate remained the same at 5.3% in January 2020 and January 2019. The estimated number of unemployed persons in January 2020 was 2.39 million compared to 2.28 million in the previous year of the same month. Among the regions, Northern Mindanao, or Region 10, had the highest labor force participation rate at 70.1%, while BARM, or the Bangsamoro Autonomous Region in Muslim Mindanao, had the lowest at 50.9% in January 2020. Meanwhile, the Cordillera Administrative Region had the highest employment rate at 97.2%, while the Ilocos region had the lowest at 91.2%. Employed persons are grouped into three broad sectors: agriculture, industry, and services. The services sector continued to comprise the largest proportion of the employed population at 58.6%, followed by the agriculture sector at 22.7%, and the industry sector at 18.8%. Employed persons are also grouped into four classes of workers. One, wage and salary workers. Second, self-employed without any paid employee. Third is unpaid family workers. And fourth, employer in own operated farm or business. Wage and salary workers were estimated at 65.2% of total employed persons in January 2020 and at 66.1% in January 2019. So wage and salary workers continue to have the largest share of the employed persons. Those who were self-employed without any paid employee made up 26.2% in January 2020 from 26% last year of the same month. Unpaid family workers, on the other hand, accounted for 6.2% of the total employed in January 2020 as compared to 4.6% in January 2019. Employer in own family-operated farm or business was estimated at 2.4% in January 2020 from 3.2% in the previous year of the same month. In terms of the mean hours of work, 67.6% of the employed persons worked 40 hours and over in January 2020, a decrease from 72.1% share in January 2019. On average, employed persons work 41.3 hours and 43.3 hours per week in January 2020 and January 2019, respectively. Underemployment rate in January 2020 decreased to 14.8% from 15.4% in the same period last year. These rates correspond to 6.32 million underemployed workers in January 2020 from 6.33 million in January 2019. Moving on, let us look at the statistics on youth labor and employment and those not in employment, education, and training, or NEET. Youth population 15 to 24 years old increased to 19.85 million in January 2020 from 19.70 million in January 2019. Youth labor force was placed at 7.43 million in January 2020, which is higher from the 7.07 million in January 2019. These numbers translate to a youth labor force participation rate of 37.4% in January 2020 and 35.9% in the previous year of the same period. Youth employment rate increased to 86.4% in January 2020 from 85.4% in January 2019. In terms of magnitude or the levels or the numbers, these rates translate to an estimated 6.42 million employed youth in January 2020 compared to 6.06 million in January 2019. Youth unemployment rate, on the other hand, was estimated at 13.6% in January 2020 from 14.2% in January 2019. These rates translate to around 1.01 million unemployed youth each in January 2020 and in January 2019. Employed youth work at an average of 38.7 hours per week in January 2020 from 41.8 hours in the previous year of the same month. Among the unemployed youth, an estimated 990,000 were not in employment, education, or training in January 2020 from 985,000 in January 2019. Among the youth who were not in the labor force, 2.37 million were not in employment, education, or training in January 2020 compared to 2.86 million in the same period last year. Overall, a total of 3.36 million youth were not in employment, education, or training in January 2020, lower from the 3.85 million in January 2019. This ends my presentation on the preliminary results of the January 2020 Labor Force Survey. We enjoin you all to participate in the upcoming 2020 Census of Population and Housing. This will be conducted in May 2020, and we hope you will welcome all our enumerators. The Philippine Statistics Authority appreciates your presence in the February 2020 Inflation and January 2020 Labor Force Survey press briefing. We look forward to meeting you again on April 7 when we report the inflation for March 2020. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, ANS Will Magalhaes. Before we open the floor for questions, we would like to remind everybody that your press kits will be sent to you via email. And before you ask your questions, please state your name and organization. We are ready for questions. Thank you.
Good morning, I inquire. Was the usual deflation of price? How much did the price decline in February?
morning, everyone. For rice, we see a decrease, and actually it has been decreasing for 10 consecutive months, starting starting May 2019. So this is already the 10th time that it's consecutively decreasing.
Yes, by how much po in February?
We will check on the average price.
For the employment data for 1 billion, no? Should we compare, just curious if we should compare the January rates with the previous one, the October rates, because the January rates, at least for the unemployment, were higher compared to the October. But are they apples to apples, or should we compare only to the year ago levels?
Yeah, it should be compared alone to the year-ago levels because of the same socioeconomic situation in the same month. Iba kasi yung sitwasyon natin noong October because if you look at the series on a quarterly basis of our employment, unemployment data, you would see that there are really seasonalities. Thank you.
When you say seasonalities, the job markets are better towards the end of the year.
For example, in October, because of the preparations for the novelty items and others, say for example, the preparation of what you call this cake na tumatagal, yung may wine siya. So, nangangailangan ng more labor employment during the period of October. And then, of course, after all the seasonal demands during December, November, December, na bumababa na yung ating employment rate pagdating ng January.
For the average decrease of price year on year, it's 7.3% is the decline. But month on month, we have 0.3%. This is positive, so it's increase. But year on year is minus 7.3%.
Good morning, Bruce Rodriguez from ABS-CBN News. On inflation po ulit, we saw, you mentioned earlier that the transport inflation was the biggest contributor, but within transport, which was the biggest driver to the slowdown? And maybe just to give a bit more context, what was happening during the month that might have caused that slowdown in transport inflation? Thank you.
Yes, for transport, it's actually the petroleum and fuels for personal transport equipment that slowed down, and we saw decreases in prices for diesel, gasoline, kerosene, LPG. But LPG is under housing, hindi na siya under transport. So there is a deceleration in the inflation for petroleum. This is actually the effect now of the rollback of prices for petroleum products, and we know that we have a rollback in February, and I think it's 4 times that we had a rollback in February. So we're seeing the effect of the rollback of the prices of petroleum in our inflation for transport.
Ma'am Wilma, regarding the unemployment numbers, yung absolute, bakit po nag-increase the same rate? Pa-clarify mo po.
Come again, kay nag-increase yung rate natin?
Where the total number of unemployed persons, 2.39 million from 2.28 million.
Yeah. That is because of the increase in the labor force and in the population. Yeah. Kasi ang labor force natin in January 2019 was 43.3 million. This January 2020 is 45.04 million.
So, yun yung
So
primary
we have the
reason.
same rate, but in terms of the levels, for the unemployed, we have higher number of unemployed persons. Although the same rate at 5.3%, but because of the bigger number of persons in the labor force, kaya tumaas yung numbers natin.
Ma'am, is that normal for January?
No, it can happen all throughout the different quarters. It would, because we're talking here of rates, even if you have the same rate, if you multiply that rate to a bigger number, then the resulting number would be bigger. Although the same yung kanilang rates.
Ma'am, pero yung sa increase ng labor force participation, is that also normal for January during this time of year? Kasi I just want to know kung seasonal ba yung gano'n. Thank you.
No, it can also happen not only in January.
Hello again. Maybe just basic question on employment figures. We saw the participation rate rise. However, unemployment was still steady. So despite the bigger denominator, we saw unemployment steady. How can we interpret that trend or that phenomenon on why is it like that? Thank you.
Yeah, labor force participation rate, again, that would be reflected back to the base, actually, which is the total number of population 15 years old and over, which also increased by 1,111. This is in million, 1.1 million increase in the total population 15 years old and over. So, medyo kasi, when you're talking of the rates, you should always refer back to the base numbers.
Thank you for that question. Do we have the next question, please? Alright, if there are no further questions, we thank everybody for participating in today's press briefing. We will invite you again to next month's press briefing on inflation, same venue, same day. Thank you very much and good morning.